The day Catherine Keller buried her husband, the sky above Harlan Creek, Texas, turned the color of old pewter, and every person who had known her since girlhood said they watched something close up behind her eyes that never opened again. That was the autumn of 1878, and by the spring of 1883, Catherine had built herself a life that was ordered and self-sufficient and sealed off from anything that might ask too much of her heart. She ran the small cattle operation her husband, Daniel Keller, had left behind, not grandly, not with great herds and hired hands and the swagger of a cattle baron, but quietly and competently, the way a woman does when she decides that the only reliable thing left in the world is her own two hands. She had a foreman named Walt Briggs who was 61 years old and moved like a man carrying a plank across his shoulders, stiff and deliberate. And she had two young ranch hands named Cody and Eli who were brothers, and who argued constantly, and who, despite all that arguing, had never once let her down. She had a garden behind the house that produced more beans and squash than any three people could eat. She had a dog named Hector who was half shepherd and half something large and unknowable, and who slept across the doorway of the house each night like a living latch. She did not go to church on Sundays, though she had once loved it. She did not attend the Saturday dances at the Harlan Creek Community Hall, though she had once been the best dancer in 3 counties. She did not accept dinner invitations from the Aldridge family, nor from the Pinkertons, nor from Martha Doyle, who had been her closest friend since the age of 7, and who asked her at least twice a season. She had not accepted a dinner invitation in 5 years. The town understood this and had largely stopped offering. There was a kind of respect in the stopping, the way people learn not to press a bruise. 5 years of that. 5 years of early mornings and hard work and the honest exhaustion that let her sleep without dreaming too much. 5 years of watching the mesquite and live oak hold their ground against the Texas wind and finding something like peace in their stubbornness. Timothy Reed rode into Harlan Creek on a Thursday in late April of 1883, and he did it the way most drifting cowboys arrived in small Texas towns, which is to say, he arrived dusty, quiet, and unremarkable looking, sitting a good bay horse and trailing a second animal loaded with his tools and a bedroll. He was 34 years old, with the kind of face that took a while to understand, not immediately handsome but steady and honest-looking, with dark brown eyes that paid attention to things most people walked past. He had a jaw that had been broken once and set slightly imperfect, and hands that were calloused in the specific pattern of a man who had spent decades working rope and iron. He wore a gray hat that had seen considerable weather, and a canvas coat the color of dry creek bed. He had come to Harlan Creek because he had spent the previous 8 years working for a rancher named Holt Garrett in the hill country near Fredericksburg, and Holt Garrett had died in February, and the Garrett family had sold everything off, and there was simply no more work there. He had heard from a man in a roadside saloon near Llano that the Keller spread outside Harlan Creek was a well-run outfit that sometimes needed a reliable hand, particularly one who could shoe horses and fix fences, and do the kind of skilled labor that younger men often lacked the patience to learn properly. He stopped first at the livery in town because that was the sensible thing, and while his horses were being looked after he walked the length of the main street and found a barber shop, and then a general store where he bought coffee and a tin of peaches. The man who ran the store, a narrow-faced fellow named Hargrove, asked him what his business was in town, the way storekeepers in small places always do, with the air of a man keeping official records. "Looking for work," Timothy said. "Heard the Keller ranch might need a hand." Hargrove set down the peaches and gave Timothy a look that was equal parts sympathy and warning. "Mrs. Keller runs a tight operation. She's particular about who she takes on." "I'm a particular kind of worker," Timothy said without arrogance. "It tends to balance out." Hargrove wrapped the coffee in paper and slid it across the counter. "She lost her husband 5 years back, Daniel Keller, good man. She keeps to herself now, just so you know what you're walking into." "I'm walking into a job interview," Timothy said, "not a dinner party." He rode out to the Keller ranch the following morning, having spent the night at the single boarding house Harlan Creek offered, run by a woman named Mrs. Fowler, who served excellent biscuits and asked no questions after 9 in the evening, which Timothy respected enormously. The Keller property announced itself with a well-maintained fence line, which Timothy noticed the way a carpenter notices a square joint. The fence posts were straight and the wire was taut, and there were no gaps where cattle had pushed through and been mended sloppily. This told him something about the people who worked here. He rode up the long, flat approach to the house, which was a solid structure of limestone and timber, not large but built to last, with a covered porch and a kitchen garden that was already showing green in the cool April morning. Walt Briggs met him before he reached the gate, stepping out from the barn with the particular slow authority of a man who has been foreman long enough to consider himself the first line of defense. He looked Timothy over the way a man looks at a horse he is considering buying, methodically and without flattery. "I heard you came through town yesterday," Walt said. "You looking for work?" "I am. I've been riding for Holt Garrett's operation near Fredericksburg for 8 years. He passed in February. I can give you references from 2 other outfits before that, both in the hill country. I shoe horses. I can build or repair almost any fence configuration you've got. I work cattle and I don't drink on the job." Walt considered him a moment longer. "Wait here," he said, and turned and walked toward the house. Timothy dismounted and stood by his horse and looked at the property. The barn was sound. The corral was level and the rails were solid. A rooster was conducting himself with great importance near the water trough. 2 young men, who must be the brothers he had heard vague mention of, were watching him from the shade of the barn door with the frank curiosity of men who had not had new company in some time. The screen door of the house opened, and Catherine Keller came out onto the porch. He saw her from across the yard, and he was not a man given to fanciful thinking, but something in the particular way she stood, one hand on the porch post and the other held loosely at her side, with the morning light catching the auburn in her brown hair, made him feel as though he had arrived somewhere significant without having planned to. She was 31 years old, with a face that had been shaped by weather and grief and hard work into something more arresting than conventional prettiness. There were lines at the corners of her eyes, and her expression was serious and careful, the expression of a woman who measured things before she gave them weight. She wore a plain dark skirt and a cotton blouse and working boots, and she held herself with a kind of contained dignity that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with survival. She walked down the porch steps and across the yard toward him, and Timothy stood still and let her approach, which was the right instinct. "I'm Catherine Keller," she said. "Walt tells me you've come about work." "Timothy Reed," he said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him the way Walt had, thorough and without sentimentality. "What kind of work are you best at?" "Horses first. I've been shoeing and training horses since I was 15. Fence work after that. I'm solid with cattle, but I won't claim to be a top hand on a drive. I'm more useful fixed in one place than moving." Something shifted slightly in her expression, a faint recalibration. "That's an honest answer. Most men coming looking for work tell me they can do everything." "Most men coming looking for work are trying to impress you," Timothy said. "I'd rather you know exactly what you're getting." A pause. The rooster made another declaration near the water trough. Hector the dog appeared from somewhere and investigated Timothy's boots with thorough interest, and Timothy let him, standing still. "References?" she said. He produced a letter from his coat pocket, folded and somewhat worn. She opened it and read it, standing there in the April morning, and he watched her read with the patience of a man comfortable in silences. She folded the letter and handed it back. "I'll give you a trial period of 2 weeks," she said. "Walt will tell you what needs doing. If you work the way this letter describes, we'll talk about something more permanent." "That's fair," he said. She turned and walked back toward the house, and that was the end of the introduction. It was clean and brief and entirely professional, and Timothy found himself quietly pleased by that. He had not come to Harlan Creek looking for anything other than work, and work was clearly what Catherine Keller was offering. The first week, he barely saw her. He worked from before sunup until the light was gone, and the work was good, the kind of solid, purposeful labor that asks everything of a man's body and leaves the mind clear. The Keller operation ran about 200 head of cattle on creek-watered grassland, which was modest but manageable. The fence line on the north side had been neglected through the winter, and there were 3 sections that needed significant repair, and Timothy set himself to that with the focused methodology of a man who genuinely enjoys the logic of a problem solved correctly. Cody and Eli, the brothers, warmed to him quickly once they established that he had no interest in competing with them or showing off, and he let them teach him the particular quirks of the Keller cattle and the land, because even a skilled man is a stranger to a new place, and it costs nothing to listen. Walt watched him work without comment for 3 days, and then on the 4th morning handed him a cup of coffee when he came out to the barn, which Timothy understood to be high praise from a man like Walt. He took his meals in the bunkhouse, where there was a small cookstove and adequate provisions. He did not eat at the main house. He was an employee on a trial period, and he understood the boundaries of that completely. But on the 9th day of his employment, he was working in the corral with a young mare that had been developing a bad habit of pulling away from the hoof pick, a tension problem that if left unaddressed would make her unmanageable for shoeing and create real trouble. And he was working through it the slow way, the right way, standing at her shoulder and letting her get used to his hand on her leg before asking her for anything. And Catherine Keller came out of the house and leaned on the corral fence and watched. He did not perform. He did not change what he was doing because someone was watching. He just kept working, slow and quiet, reading the mare's body, waiting for the moment she stopped bracing against him. After perhaps 20 minutes, Catherine said, "My husband could never get that mare to trust him." Timothy looked up. She was watching the horse, not him. "She's not a mean horse," he said. "She's a scared one, different problem." A silence. "She came with the ranch," Catherine said. "A neighbor sold her to Daniel as a 4-year-old, said she was difficult. Daniel thought he could work it out of her by being firm." She paused. "He was firm about most things." Timothy returned his attention to the mare. "Firmness works on some horses. Some of them just need to be believed in for a while." He did not look up when he said it, and later he was not entirely sure why he had, because it was more than he usually offered in conversation with an employer. But it sat in the air between them without awkwardness, and Catherine stood at the fence for another few minutes before she said quietly, "Come up to the house when you're done with her. I'll have supper ready." He almost said that wasn't necessary, that he had provisions in the bunkhouse, and then he stopped himself, because the offer was a small thing and refusing it would make it larger. "Thank you," he said instead. That first shared meal was quiet and careful. The kitchen was clean and warm, and Catherine had made a beef stew with the biscuits that had clearly been made from a recipe used so many times it required no thought, and there was coffee and dried apple preserves. They sat at the kitchen table, and Timothy ate with the sincere appreciation of a man who has been cooking for himself in a bunkhouse for 9 days, and Catherine ate with the slight stiffness of a woman doing something she had not done in a while, feeding a guest at her table. They talked about the ranch. They talked about the spring conditions and the state of the cattle, and what the fence repair was going to require on the south pasture. They did not talk about anything personal. It was efficient and pleasant, and when he thanked her at the door and walked back to the bunkhouse in the cool evening, Timothy Reed thought that Catherine Keller was the most self-contained person he had ever met, and that there was something both admirable and terribly lonely about that. At the end of 2 weeks, she offered him a permanent position, and he accepted. The spring moved into summer with the particular slow intensity of a Texas season, the heat building day by day, the sky vast and relentless and blue, the cattle drifting toward the creek shade in the afternoons. Timothy settled into the rhythms of the Keller ranch with a naturalness that Walt later told Cody and Eli was unusual for a man so recently arrived, that most men needed at least a full season to learn the particular logic of a place. But Timothy Reed seemed to understand it faster, like he had been paying attention to the right things from the start. He and Catherine developed a workday rhythm that was productive and comfortable. In the mornings he would come to the kitchen door, not the front door, and she would have a brief list of priorities for the day, and he would take that list and work through it methodically. And in the evenings she sometimes called him up for supper and sometimes did not, and either way was fine with him, because he was not keeping count. But he noticed things, the way a man notices things when his attention is genuinely engaged. He noticed that she worked harder than was strictly necessary, as if idleness was something to be afraid of. He noticed that she read in the evenings, sitting on the porch when the heat relented, a lamp beside her and a book on her knee, and that she read with the particular intensity of a person using literature as a door to somewhere else. He noticed that she had a quick, dry wit that came out occasionally in the day's work conversation and then retreated, as if she had shown something she had not meant to. He noticed that on the last Sunday of May she put on a black dress and visited the small cemetery at the edge of the Keller property, where Daniel Keller was buried under a limestone marker, and that she came back from that visit with a face so carefully composed it ached to look at. He did not comment on any of these things. He was not employed to comment on them. In June, something happened that altered the arrangement between them without either of them choosing it. There had been tension in the region for several months over water rights. The Keller property drew water from a branch of a creek that also ran through land recently acquired by a man named Prescott Avery, who had come into the hill country from somewhere east with money and ambition, and the kind of certainty that money and ambition often produce in men who have not been tested. Avery had begun, through the spring, to make quiet arrangements that would effectively divert more of the creek water to his property, not dramatically, not with the outright aggression that would have invited immediate legal action, but gradually, through the placement of a small earthwork dam on his side of the property line that reduced the downstream flow to the Keller pastures. Catherine had known about it for weeks and had been managing the situation through letters to the county land office, careful and correct and proper, the way a woman who respects the law and has limited resources manages a situation that could turn ugly. But in early June, 2 of Avery's men had come onto Keller property and torn down a section of fence near the creek boundary, which was not a legal dispute anymore but a trespass and a provocation. Walt had wanted to ride to Avery's outfit and have what he called a plain conversation, which everyone understood to mean a confrontation, and Catherine had told him firmly that they would handle it through the sheriff's office, and Walt had accepted this with the expression of a man accepting medicine he finds distasteful. Timothy said nothing in that conversation. It was not his place. But the following morning he rode into Harlan Creek before anyone else was up, and he was back by mid-morning with the county deputy, a capable-looking man named Harkins, and he had also stopped at the land office and obtained a copy of the original property survey that showed clearly where the creek boundary lay and what the water rights documentation said, which was that the Keller Ranch had prior claim to the creek flow by 14 years. When he handed Catherine the survey copy and explained what he had done, she looked at the paper in her hands for a long moment and then looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. It was something more complicated, the look of a person who has been doing everything alone for so long that a single practical act of assistance arrives with unexpected weight. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "The sooner the legal record is clear, the sooner Avery knows the ground isn't as soft as he thought," Timothy said. "It's easier to stop a thing early." "You rode to town before dawn," she said. "I was awake anyway." She looked at him a moment longer. "Thank you, Timothy." It was the first time she had used his given name, and he noticed it, and he was careful not to make anything of it in his expression, because that was the right thing to do. Deputy Harkins paid a formal visit to Prescott Avery that afternoon, and the water situation resolved itself with satisfying quietness over the following 2 weeks. Avery was not a fool, and a prior water claim of 14 years combined with an official visit from the county was a wall he had the sense not to run into directly. The earthwork dam was quietly removed. The fence section was repaired, and nobody ever directly acknowledged who had torn it down. After that, Catherine began calling him up to the house for supper more often than not. They still talked mostly about the ranch, the work, the land, the practical concerns of running a cattle operation through a hot Texas summer. But gradually, the way water finds its way through stone not with force but with persistence, other things found their way into the conversation. She mentioned a book she was reading one evening, something about the natural history of the Southwest, and he told her he had read it, which surprised her, and they spent the better part of an hour discussing it with the slight competitive pleasure of two people discovering they can match each other intellectually. He told her about the hill country, about the Garrett Ranch, about 8 years of good work for a man he had genuinely respected. She told him about coming to Texas as a girl with her family from Tennessee, about how different the landscape had seemed to her young eyes, vast and dry and ancient-looking after the green gentleness of home. He did not ask about Daniel. He would not have asked. But one evening in late July, when the heat had gentled slightly and they were sitting on the porch after supper with the coffee cooling in their hands, she began to talk about him herself. Daniel was a good man, she said, looking out at the dark shapes of the live oak trees against the evening sky. He worked this land from nothing. He was honest and fair, and he loved me as well as he knew how. Timothy said nothing, which was right. He died of a fever, she said. It came on in 3 days and it was over in 5. There was nothing to be done. The doctor from town came out twice, but there was simply nothing. I sat with him every hour of it. She paused. I was 26 years old. That's a hard age to be made a widow, Timothy said quietly. Any age is a hard age for that, she said. Yes, he agreed. But there's something particular about it happening before a person has finished building their life. There's a sense that the ground has been taken out before the house was finished. She looked at him. Yes, she said slowly. That's exactly it. People always said how young I was, but they said it meaning I had time ahead of me. What they didn't understand is that I had already stopped thinking about time that way. A long quiet. The night insects were singing. What did you lose? She asked him then, not intrusively, but with the directness of a woman who has learned that indirect questions waste time. He was quiet for a moment. Not the same as you, he said honestly. I was engaged to a woman in San Antonio 10 years ago now. She decided she did not want the life I was offering. Ranch work and moving around and no certainty of where we'd land. She married a merchant. I understood it. Did it hurt? Yes, but differently than what you're describing. It was a door closing. What happened to you sounds more like a floor falling away. She regarded him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, that look of someone measuring the distance between what they expected from a person and what they were actually getting. You describe things carefully, she said. I think carefully, he said. It tends to come out that way. She said nothing for a while, and the coffee was cold by the time either of them spoke again. What they talked about after that was unimportant, inconsequential ranch things. Whether the south pasture gate needed a new hinge, whether the roan gelding was ready to be worked with cattle. But something had shifted in the air between them, gentle and irreversible as the season changing, and both of them knew it without naming it. August arrived with its full, uncompromising heat, and the work of a ranch in high summer is relentless in the way of things that cannot wait. Cattle do not stop needing water and feed because the temperature is punishing, and fences do not fix themselves, and horses do not shoe themselves. Timothy worked through it with the same steady competence he brought to everything, and there was a satisfaction in the Keller operation that summer that everyone on the place could feel, a sense of a machine running well, of work done properly and in time. Martha Doyle came out to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late August, the way she had been doing every few weeks for 5 years, with no invitation required because she was the kind of friend that needed no invitation. She was a small woman with bright, clever eyes and the social confidence of someone who had never in her life struggled to be liked. And she found Catherine in the kitchen garden, and she talked for 2 hours about everything in Harlan Creek worth talking about, and some things not worth talking about. Timothy was working at the corral, and Martha Doyle looked at him with open and unashamed assessment when she first arrived, the way women in small towns look at new men when there is a widow they care about. After an hour, she found an excuse to drift toward the corral fence on her way back to her wagon, and she engaged Timothy in conversation with the smooth ease of an expert. He was polite and direct and gave her very little in the way of information, and she liked him for that, because a man who cannot resist telling a stranger everything about himself is never trustworthy. When she was driving back to town, she stopped her wagon and looked at the dust of the Keller ranch behind her and thought about what she had seen, the particular quality of the quiet between Catherine and this man when they were anywhere near each other, the way he watched her when she was not looking, the way Catherine moved differently than she had in years. Less like someone carrying a weight they had forgotten was there, and more like someone who had recently set it down for a moment and was surprised to find the ground solid under them. Martha Doyle was not a woman who made hasty judgments, but she made this one with full confidence. She did not say anything to Catherine about it. Not yet. She had known Catherine long enough to know that naming a thing too soon was the surest way to make it run. September came, and with it a shift in the air, a faint cool edge in the mornings and evenings that was not quite autumn but was the announcement of it, and the mesquite trees began that slow transaction of color that preceded the fall. The days were still warm, but they were bearable again, and the work of the ranch settled into a more sustainable pace. There was a dance at the Harlan Creek Community Hall the third Saturday of September, the kind of seasonal event that the town took seriously, with a proper caller and a fiddle player who came from a town 20 miles east and who was worth the trouble. Walt and Cody and Eli went, because they were men who wanted to dance, and Eli had been paying particular attention to a farmer's daughter named Rose Hatch, and he had the distracted look of a young man in the specific early stages of that condition. Catherine was not going. This was understood by everyone. She had not attended the community dance in 5 years. Timothy was not planning to go either. He was not a man who particularly sought out social gatherings, and he had no particular reason to ride into town on a Saturday evening. But on Friday afternoon, Eli came back from a trip to the general store in Harlan Creek and reported, with the flushed enthusiasm of someone delivering news he finds important, that Rose Hatch had told him that the Prescott Avery family would be attending the dance, and that Prescott himself had apparently been telling people in town that he was thinking of making an offer on some property adjacent to the Keller range. Catherine was at the kitchen door when Eli reported this, and Timothy watched her face go still in the careful way it went still when she was managing something. Avery acquiring adjacent property would mean a new shared boundary and the resumption of exactly the pressure they had just resolved. That evening at supper, Timothy said, "I thought I might ride into town tomorrow evening for the dance." Catherine looked up from her plate. "I don't dance particularly well," he added, which was not entirely true. "But it might be useful to have someone from this ranch in the room when Prescott Avery is there." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I used to love to dance." The sentence arrived with such simplicity and such weight that it stopped the conversation entirely. Timothy looked at her. She was looking at her coffee cup. Her expression was the careful, composed expression, but underneath it was something he had not seen before, not grief, not exactly, but a kind of longing that had been so well managed for so long it had almost forgotten what it was longing for. "Then come," he said, quietly and directly. She looked up. "It's a dance," he said. "Not a dinner invitation, not a social obligation. It's just music and a room full of people and a chance to do something you used to love. A long pause. The lamp on the table put warm light on the side of her face. I have not attended a social event in 5 years, she said. I know, the whole town knows, that's a lot of years for something to become a habit. He picked up his coffee cup. Habits can be broken. It's more complicated than a habit, she said with a slight edge. I know that too, he said without deflecting. It's a way of protecting yourself, and it has worked. But I don't think you need as much protection as you think you do. Not anymore. She was quiet for a long time. He did not fill the silence. I would need to find something suitable to wear, she said finally, and the way she said it, as though she was testing out the idea by speaking it aloud, told him that was as close to yes as he was going to get tonight. You have time, he said. It's tomorrow. He said it easily without pressing and moved the conversation to other things and left her to make her own decision. She went to the dance. She wore a dark blue dress that she had not worn in 5 years, and her hair was pinned up in a way that was less severe than her usual working arrangement. And when she came down the porch steps to where Timothy had the horses ready, he turned and looked at her and did not say anything for a moment because he was simply looking at her. And then he said, "The dance is going to be better for your being there." That's a very large statement to make based on a dress, she said, but she was almost smiling. It's not about the dress, he said, and handed her the reins of her horse. She did smile then, briefly and privately, looking at the horse, and Timothy swung up onto his own horse, and they rode toward town through the September evening, through the smell of mesquite and dry grass and the first faint cool of autumn, and neither of them talked much, but neither of them was uncomfortable about that. At the community hall, the news of Catherine Keller's appearance traveled around the room in approximately 4 minutes. Timothy watched it happen with a certain quiet amusement, the way conversations paused and heads turned, and the particular expression appeared on people's faces that indicated they were recalibrating something they had considered settled. Martha Doyle saw Catherine from across the room, and her face broke into a smile of pure, undisguised delight that she did not bother to conceal. Timothy stayed close, but not obtrusively close, for the first hour, and he did what he had come to do, which was to be present and watchful when Prescott Avery arrived with his wife and 2 associates. He observed Avery's expression when he saw the Keller presence represented, observed the slight recalculation behind the man's eyes, and he placed himself strategically in the room so that if Avery wished to speak to anyone from the Keller operation, he would have to go through Timothy first. Avery chose not to speak to anyone from the Keller operation. This was precisely the desired outcome. In the second hour, when the dancing was well underway and the fiddle player was earning his pay, Timothy found Catherine standing at the side of the room with Martha Doyle, who had drawn a small circle of women around her that was half social occasion and half barely contained protective formation, and he stopped in front of her and said simply, "Would you like to dance?" She looked at him. The room was loud and bright around them, the fiddle and the caller and the shuffle of feet on the wooden floor, and she had her hands clasped in front of her in the careful, composed way, and she held his gaze for a moment that stretched out. "It has been a long time," she said. "That's all right," he said, and offered his hand. She took it. They danced 2 dances, and then a third because the fiddler moved directly into it without stopping. She had not been wrong that it had been a long time, and there was a stiffness in the first dance that was about more than unfamiliarity with the steps. It was the stiffness of someone allowing themselves to be touched, to be close to another person, to be visible in joy rather than in grief. But by the second dance the stiffness was gone, and by the third she was dancing the way the storekeeper Hargrove's wife later described it to her sister in a letter, like a woman who had been standing outside in the cold for so long she had forgotten what warmth felt like, and was now remembering. Timothy was a better dancer than he had claimed to be, considerably better. She noticed this and called him on it as they came off the floor, and he had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I said I didn't dance particularly well," he said. "I didn't say I couldn't." "That is a very specific distinction," she said. "I'm a careful man with words," he said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and surprised out of her, and it was the most extraordinary thing Timothy Reed had heard in years. Martha Doyle, watching from across the room, allowed herself one small triumphant expression before arranging her face into its normal pleasant configuration. On the ride back to the ranch, under a sky crowded with stars and a half-moon that turned the mesquite silver, they talked easily and lightly, about nothing important, about the dance, about the fiddler's particular style, about Eli's painfully transparent happiness whenever Rose Hatch had been within 20 feet of him. The ease of the conversation was new, not the careful professional courtesy of the summer, but something looser and warmer, and when they reached the ranch and Timothy took her horse's reins at the corral gate, she paused before going to the house. "Thank you," she said, "for suggesting it." "I didn't suggest it," he said. "I invited you." A pause. "There's a difference. You suggested something once that I might consider staying on permanently," he said. "That was a suggestion. An invitation means you actively want someone to come." She stood in the moonlight looking at him for a long moment. "Then thank you for the invitation," she said softly. He nodded, and she walked to the house, and he unsaddled the horses and brushed them down and went to the bunkhouse, and he lay in the dark listening to the night sounds of the Texas ranch, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the particular warmth of wanting to be exactly where he was. October on the ranch was harvest time, the cattle being sorted and counted, and the business of selling and planning and accounting for the year, and Timothy took on the task of driving the sell cattle to the Harlan Creek stockyards with Cody, while Eli stayed back to help Walt with the property work. The drive was 2 days out and 2 days back, and it was the longest he had been away from the ranch since his arrival. When he returned on the 4th evening, dusty and tired from the road, Catherine met him at the barn, which she had not done before. She said she had been monitoring the roan gelding, who had shown some lameness in his left foreleg, and she wanted his assessment. This was entirely reasonable and entirely true. But she had also plainly been watching for his return, and she had not waited until morning to check on the horse. He examined the gelding's leg carefully and pronounced it a minor thing, a tender spot from a stone bruise that would resolve with rest, and she nodded with a composed expression, and then she said, "Supper's on the stove if you haven't eaten." "I haven't," he said. "I'd appreciate it." Across the kitchen table, with the lamp lit and the smell of beef and corn in the warm air, he told her about the stockyards and the prices, which were good this year, and she listened with the focused intelligence she brought to ranch business, asking clear questions and making quick calculations. Then he reached into his coat and produced a small wrapped package. "There was a bookseller in town," he said, "who had come through with a wagon from San Antonio. He had this, and I thought of you." She opened the paper, wrapping carefully. It was a natural history of the Texas Hill Country, beautifully illustrated with engravings of birds and plants and geological formations. She looked at it for a long moment, running her fingers over the cover, and then she looked at him and said nothing, because some things arrive with such precise rightness that there are no words adequate to the feeling. "I remembered you said you wanted to know more about this part of the country," he said simply. "When you came as a girl from Tennessee and everything looked so foreign." "I did say that," she said quietly. "2 months ago. You remembered." "I tend to remember things that matter," he said. She opened the book to the first engraved plate, a detailed rendering of a red-tailed hawk in flight, and she studied it with the slightly softened face she had when she was genuinely moved, and he picked up his coffee and let her look, because knowing when to be quiet was one of the things he did best. November came in cold and decisive, the way Texas falls often do. 1 week of gentle warning and then a hard north wind that meant business. The cattle were in their winter pastures, and the ranch work shifted to maintenance and preparation. The roof of the barn checked and reinforced. The bunkhouse stove cleaned and fitted with new pipe sections. The supply of firewood accounted for and found wanting, which meant 3 days of hard cutting and splitting. Timothy and Catherine worked alongside each other on many of these tasks in a way that had become entirely natural, and the men on the ranch had long since stopped thinking of Timothy Reed as a hand who might move on, and had begun thinking of him as something permanent to the place, the way a cornerstone becomes permanent. Martha Doyle came out to the ranch in early November and found Catherine in the kitchen with the natural history book open on the table and a cup of tea, which was a scene of such domestic contentment that Martha stood in the doorway for a moment before knocking and thought that Catherine Keller looked like a woman who had found her way back to herself. They sat and talked for 2 hours, and Martha did not mention Timothy directly until she was putting her coat on to leave, and then she said casually, in the voice she used when she was not being casual at all, "He's a good man, Catherine." Catherine did not ask who she meant. "I know," she said. "He looks at you like you are the most interesting thing in any room he walks into," Martha said, still with the coat. A pause. "Martha." "I'm not saying anything," Martha said. "I'm just a woman who has known you since you were 7 years old and who wants you to be happy." She fastened the coat button. "Daniel would want you to be happy too, you know that." "I know," Catherine said again, more quietly. "Knowing and believing are different things," Martha said. "I'll see you next month." And she was out the door and into her wagon before Catherine could respond, which was entirely intentional. Catherine sat alone in the kitchen after Martha left and looked at the natural history book and thought about what it meant that she had spent the last 6 months looking forward to each day in a way she had not done in 5 years. She thought about the dance, and the way she had laughed, and the book from the bookseller's wagon, and the specific quality of the silence when she and Timothy sat on the porch in the evenings. A silence that was not emptiness but the opposite of emptiness, a silence full of presence. She also thought about the weight of what she had built in these 5 years of solitude, the self-sufficiency, the stability, the protection of a heart that had already been broken once. She thought about the way grief works on a person, how it can calcify around a wound and become both protection and prison. She had been living in a very well-maintained prison. The thought arrived with such clarity that she put her coffee cup down abruptly. 2 days later, in the middle of the week, Timothy came in from a long day of fence work on the north pasture, cold and dirty and tired, and Catherine met him at the barn not with a question about the gelding or a concern about cattle, but simply met him there, standing in the lantern light of the barn door, and she said, "I have been thinking about something." He unsaddled his horse and rubbed it down, listening. "I have been keeping you at a proper distance," she said, "because it was the proper thing to do and because I had decided, quite deliberately, that this was the life I would lead. A useful life and a quiet one." She paused. "I think I made that decision out of fear rather than wisdom, and I think I have been so careful about maintaining it that I have nearly missed something important." He set down the brush and turned to look at her. The lantern put warm light on both of them, and outside the barn the November wind moved through the mesquite with a sound like the edge of something. "Catherine," he said. "Let me finish," she said, with a slight lift of the hand that was a very Catherine gesture, asking for the floor. "I am not a woman who is good at speaking around things. I have watched you work this ranch for 7 months, and I have eaten supper with you at my kitchen table more evenings than I can count, and I have read the book you brought me from San Antonio 3 times, and I think that you are the most genuinely decent person I have met since Daniel died, and I think I have been hiding from you behind a wall of professional correctness, and I think I would like to stop." He was quiet for a moment, holding her gaze. Then he said, "I have been in love with you since somewhere around the middle of June, when you told me about coming from Tennessee as a girl and how foreign everything looked, and I decided that the most important thing I could do was give you all the time you needed and not push a single moment of it." She stared at him. "I'm not a man who does things impulsively," he said. "I was prepared to wait considerably longer." "Since June," she repeated. "Possibly May," he said honestly. She stood in the barn doorway looking at him, and then something in her face simply opened, like a door that has been latched for a long time swinging wide on well-oiled hinges, and she crossed the barn floor, and he met her halfway, and when she put her face against the front of his canvas coat, and his arms came around her, she felt something release in her chest that she had not known was still clenched. They stood like that for a long moment, in the warm lantern light of the barn with the wind outside and the horse shifting quietly in the stall behind them. And Timothy Reed held Catherine Keller and thought that there was no place in the world he would rather be. "You smell like fence wire and cold air," she said into his coat. "I've been building fence all day," he said. "I know," she said. "I watched from the north pasture gate for a while this afternoon." He pulled back enough to look at her, and she met his eyes with the particular expression he had come to think of as Catherine without the wall, direct and clear and carrying everything she was. He bent his head and kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it was not tentative or uncertain. It was the kiss of two people who have been patient for a very long time and know the value of what they have been waiting for. December came in with cold clarity, a real Texas winter settling over the hill country, and the Keller ranch in December was a different kind of beautiful, the live oak holding its dark green against the pale winter sky, the creek running clear and cold over pale limestone, the cattle blowing small clouds of breath in the mornings. There was ice in the water troughs 2 mornings in a row that second week, and Timothy got up before anyone else and broke it with the methodical thoroughness of a man who takes pleasure in having done the necessary things before they are needed. The change in the relationship between Catherine and Timothy was not a secret, but neither was it an announcement. It was simply visible to anyone paying attention, the way light is visible, as a thing that changes the character of everything around it without declaring itself. Cody and Eli nudged each other with the satisfied look of young men who enjoy being right about something they had predicted months earlier. Walt said nothing whatsoever, but his coffee offered to Timothy in the mornings now came with a slight additional warmth in the delivery. Martha Doyle, when she came out for her December visit and read the room in approximately 45 seconds, stepped back onto the porch and made a small private sound of pure satisfaction before going back inside with a perfectly normal expression. On a Sunday in the middle of December, something happened that Timothy had not planned for in any specific sense, but that was so clearly the right moment that he did not hesitate. He had ridden into Harlan Creek for supplies, and while there he had stopped at the jeweler's shop, a small establishment run by a Swiss man named Weber who had come to Texas, with skills utterly mismatched to his surroundings, and had somehow thrived anyway. In Weber's glass case was a ring with a small garnet stone set in silver, simple and fine and not ostentatious, the kind of ring that was made to last a lifetime rather than impress a room. Timothy bought it. When he came back to the ranch that evening, he did not wait or plan an elaborate scene, because he was not an elaborate man, and Catherine was not a woman who needed elaborate things. He found her in the kitchen going through the ranch's account book with the focused expression she wore for numbers, and he stood in the doorway and she looked up, and he said, "I have something to ask you." She looked at him for a long moment, reading his expression with the directness she brought to everything, and she set down the account book. He crossed the room and sat down across from her at the kitchen table and put the small paper-wrapped ring on the table between them and said, "I am not a wealthy man, and I cannot promise you a grand life. What I can promise you is that I will work this land beside you for as long as you want me here, and that I will be honest with you every day, and that I will never stop paying attention to the things that matter to you, and I am asking if you will marry me." Catherine looked at the small package on the table and then at him. Her eyes were bright. She was very still in the way she was still when something had moved her too deeply for an immediate response. "You are already paying attention to the things that matter to me," she said after a moment. "You have been since May." "I know," he said. "I'm asking for the right to do it permanently." She reached across the table and picked up the paper package and unwrapped it, and she looked at the garnet ring in the winter kitchen light, and then she looked at him and said, "Yes, Timothy." He took the ring and put it on her finger, and she held her hand still and looked at it, and then looked at him with the open face, the one without the wall, and he took her hand in both of his. "I have been afraid," she said quietly, "for a long time that loving someone again meant I was somehow being disloyal to Daniel, meaning that it meant his life and his death mattered less." "It doesn't mean that," Timothy said. "I know," she said. "Martha told me something once. She said that a heart that has loved greatly does not have less capacity for love after loss. It has more." She squeezed his hand. "She was right." "She strikes me as a woman who is frequently right," Timothy said. Catherine laughed, and it was the unguarded laugh, the real one, and he thought he would spend the rest of his life finding ways to earn that laugh. They were married in the last week of February 1884, on a cold, bright Saturday morning at the Harlan Creek church, which was Catherine's return to it after 5 years, and which the congregation received with a warmth that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with genuine affection for a woman they had watched carry a weight for too long. Martha Doyle stood beside Catherine as her witness with an expression of uncontainable happiness. Walt Briggs stood beside Timothy with the expression of a man who has just watched a very satisfying piece of work reach its proper conclusion. The dress Catherine wore was not black. It was the dark blue dress from the September dance, with new lace at the collar that she had sewn herself in the evenings over the previous 2 weeks. She looked, in the opinion of everyone present, like a woman who had come back to life. The reverend who married them was a compact man named Abernathy who had conducted Daniel Keller's funeral 5 years earlier, and who looked at Catherine's face now with the private relief of a man who has long hoped for exactly this. His ceremony was brief and warm, and he said things about the joining of 2 lives that sounded, for once, as though they meant exactly what the words said. Timothy held Catherine's hand throughout the ceremony with the steady, unhurried grip of a man who knows what he has, and is not going to let any amount of time or circumstance loosen his hold on it. They returned to the ranch after a celebratory dinner at the Harlan Creek Hotel, hosted by Martha Doyle and attended by Walt and Cody and Eli and several other friends. And it was the first formal dinner Catherine had attended in 5 years, and she sat at the long table surrounded by people she loved, and the food was excellent, and there was good wine, and she laughed several times during the meal with the real laugh. And Martha Doyle sat at the other end of the table and watched her, and felt a quiet, deep satisfaction that was among the best things she had ever felt. In the spring of 1884, Timothy moved fully into the main house, which was a practical arrangement that both of them had understood was coming, but which arrived with a particular domestic sweetness, the way a home changes when it becomes fully inhabited, when 2 people's rhythms and habits and small preferences fill the rooms and make them different than they were before. He built 2 additional shelves in the sitting room for Catherine's books. She rearranged the kitchen to his advantage because she had noticed he was 6 feet tall, and the upper cabinet shelf was an inch too low for him to reach comfortably, which he had never mentioned. These small adjustments and accommodations, made without fuss or announcement, were the daily language of a good marriage beginning. Walt, who had been foreman since Daniel Keller's time, announced in April that his joints were telling him he had 5 years left in heavy work and that he intended to use them wisely. He was not quitting. He was just informing everyone of the timetable, which was very Walt. Timothy and Catherine discussed the long-term structure of the ranch operation together in the evenings, with the engaged partnership of 2 people who are genuinely equal in a project, and the conversations were productive and good. They extended the north pasture fence to accommodate 30 additional cattle, which was a modest expansion but a sound one, and the summer of 1884 was better financially than any year since Daniel's death. Catherine kept the books, as she always had, and presented the numbers to Timothy with the thoroughness of a woman who respects both competence and transparency, and he read them with the thoroughness of a man who intends to earn the trust that transparency represents. On an evening in June, Catherine told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen after supper, with the account book open in front of her and the lamp lit and the early summer air coming through the screen door, and she said it directly, the way she did everything, looking at him across the table. "I am going to have a child in January," she said. "The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday." Timothy looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on him before, a complete unguarded openness that was nothing like his usual steady composure, something purely joyful and slightly overwhelmed and entirely beautiful. Got up from the table and came around and crouched beside her chair and took her hands in his and said, "Are you all right? Are you healthy?" "I am very healthy," she said. "The doctor was very clear." "Good," he said, and then he put his forehead against her hands and she felt him take a long, quiet breath. "Good," he said again. She put her hand on his head gently, the way you put your hand on the head of something precious. "You're going to make a wonderful father," she said. He looked up at her. "I intend to," he said, with the absolute simple honesty that was his fundamental character. The pregnancy through the summer and fall was straightforward and healthy, as promised. Catherine reduced her physical labor gradually and without particular complaint, because she was a practical woman and the ranch had enough hands to absorb the reallocation. Timothy became, without making a declaration of it, attentive in the specific way of a man who is tracking the person most important to him in every room, not hovering or anxious but present, the way a good horse is present to its rider. Walt Briggs, who had been around cattle operations long enough to have delivered calves in ice storms, told Timothy with great authority that he was going to be fine, and that the main thing was to stay calm, which was advice Timothy received with polite gratitude and privately found somewhat ironic, since staying calm had never been his particular challenge. Now, there was one remaining thing from the years of Catherine's widowhood that had not yet fully resolved, and it came to a head in November, when Prescott Avery approached the Keller ranch not with legal maneuvering this time, but with a direct offer to buy the south pasture and the creek access that came with it. The offer was financially generous, Avery was not stupid, and it was designed to be tempting to a woman managing a ranch alone. But Catherine Keller was no longer alone, and the offer landed with entirely different weight than Avery had calculated. Timothy and Catherine sat together at the kitchen table with Avery's written proposal and a pot of coffee, and they discussed it with the clear-eyed practicality they brought to every ranch decision. And by the end of the conversation, the answer was obvious to both of them. The south pasture and its creek access were the arterial system of the entire Keller operation. Selling it would be like removing a wall from a house and calling the structure sound. Timothy rode to Harlan Creek the following morning and met with the same attorney who had helped resolve the water rights question, a careful man named Aldridge, and together they composed a response to Avery that was polite, specific, and entirely final. Avery, to his credit, accepted the answer. He understood the ground had changed, that the Keller ranch was no longer a widow's operation managing on borrowed time but a functioning partnership with permanence, and he turned his attention to other acquisitions. The threat was gone, cleanly and permanently, and the Keller property was secure. On the 15th of January, 1885, in the bedroom of the limestone and timber house on the Keller ranch, with the midwife from town and Martha Doyle in attendance, and Timothy Reed doing an extremely convincing impression of a calm man in the kitchen, Catherine Keller Reed gave birth to a son. He was healthy and large and extremely vocal about his arrival, and Martha Doyle brought him to the kitchen doorway wrapped in the blanket that Catherine had been making in pieces through the autumn, and she held him out to Timothy and said, "There you are." Timothy took the child with the hands that had built fences and shod horses and held a woman together by simply being steady, and he looked at his son's face, this entirely new person who had simply arrived in the world like a declaration, and he felt something move through him that was beyond articulation, a love so immediate and absolute it was like weather, something that arrived fully formed. "Is Catherine all right?" he said first. "She is remarkable," Martha said, which was an entirely accurate assessment. He brought the baby back to Catherine, who was in the bed with the exhausted dignity of a woman who has just done a very large thing, and he sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she looked at the child and then at him and said, "What would you like to name him?" "We said Daniel," he said. "If it was a boy." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright and her expression was the fully open one. "Daniel James Reed," she said, testing the weight of it. "After my father's middle name." "After your father," he confirmed. Because it was right, it was completely right, and he had known it was right when they had discussed it in October by the fireplace with the autumn rain on the windows. She looked down at the child and then said quietly, "Daniel would have liked you. My Daniel, he would have respected you." "I know," Timothy said gently, "and I never had any wish to replace him, only to be here." "You are here," she said. "You have been here since May of 1883, and I have never once doubted that you would stay." He took her hand, careful of the sleeping child between them, and held it in the way he had held it since the February morning when the Reverend told him he could, steadily and completely, with no reserve. Young Daniel James Reed grew through the spring and summer of 1885 with the cheerful unreasonableness of all infants, and the ranch absorbed this new life, the way good land absorbs rain, completely and productively. Cody and Eli competed for the role of favorite honorary uncle with a dedication that Timothy found quietly amusing. Walt Briggs, who had raised 3 children of his own before outliving his wife and his middle son, sat in the kitchen with the baby on his knee on Sunday mornings and told him things about cattle in a low, steady voice, as if conducting an early education, which Catherine declared was the most touching thing she had ever seen, and which Walt claimed was simply occupying his time. In the second week of March 1885, something arrived at the Keller ranch that nobody had been expecting, which was a letter from California. It was addressed to Timothy Reed, and it was from a woman named Edna Garrett, who was the daughter of Holt Garrett, the rancher Timothy had worked for in Fredericksburg before coming to Harlan Creek. The letter informed Timothy that the Garrett estate had been unsatisfactorily managed in the disposition after Holt's death in 1883, and that there had been a sum of money, wages owed and a bequest Holt had intended in his will, that had been held up in the estate process and was now finally resolved and payable. The sum was not large by the standards of wealthy men, but by the standards of a working ranch in 1885 in Texas, it was significant, enough to run the Keller operation for 2 full years or to make a specific capital investment. Timothy brought the letter to Catherine and set it on the kitchen table and said, "This is what I would like to do with this." She read the letter and looked at him. "The south pasture fence has needed replacing for 3 years," he said. "The bunkhouse roof is not going to survive another bad winter, and the creek crossing needs a proper wooden bridge before the next flood season because right now we lose a week of work every time the water is high." Had a list in his head, specific and practical and ordered. Those 3 things done right would make this ranch sound for 15 years. "Those 3 things," she said, "are all things that benefit the ranch, which is now as much yours as it is mine. Which is why I am offering the money," he said simply. "Timothy," she said, and put her hand over his on the table, "this is your money. From your years of work for another man, you could do anything with it." "I know what I want to do with it," he said. "I am doing it." She looked at him across the table with the direct, clear look she gave to things that had moved her deeply, and she said, "I am very glad you rode into Harlan Creek in April of 1883. "So am I," he said, "though the road was long and the boarding-house bed was extremely uncomfortable." She laughed, and he smiled, and the baby made a sound from the sitting room that indicated his current mood, and Hector the dog walked through the kitchen with the eternal composure of a dog who has seen enough human activity to be unimpressed by most of it. The fence work and the bunkhouse roof and the creek bridge were all completed before summer, and Walt Briggs inspected each one with the thoroughness of a man who has seen too many corners cut in his lifetime, and pronounced each one sound, which was the highest available praise. Eli married Rose Hatch in the spring of 1885, which was an event the entire community had been expecting since approximately the September dance of 1883, and the wedding was held on the Hatch farm and attended by everyone from the Keller ranch with great festivity. Eli's expression throughout the ceremony was that of a man who cannot believe his own good fortune, which Catherine told Timothy quietly was an expression she recognized, and he squeezed her hand. Cody, energized by his brother's matrimonial success, began paying court to a schoolteacher named Alice Drummond, who had come to Harlan Creek the previous autumn to run the new school, and who received his attentions with a skepticism that Cody clearly found invigorating rather than discouraging. Martha Doyle, observing this development, declared that Harlan Creek was experiencing what she called a season of resolution, which was her way of saying that things that should have happened were happening, and she approved. By the summer of 1886, the Keller Ranch, which had carried Timothy Reed's name alongside Catherine's in every practical and legal sense since the February of their marriage, was the most efficiently run small cattle operation in the county, according to the opinion of Walt Briggs, who despite his stated retirement timeline had not actually retired, because there was always something useful to do, and he found idleness deeply unsatisfying. On a July evening of that year, Catherine and Timothy sat on the porch of the limestone house in the last light of a long summer day, with Daniel, now 18 months old and full of the purposeful mobility of a toddler, who has recently discovered that walking is the beginning and not the end of possibilities, conducting investigations of the porch steps under the supervision of Hector, who was doing an impeccable job. The air smelled of mesquite and evening, and the faint sweetness of the kitchen garden behind the house. The sky was doing the extraordinary thing that Texas skies do in July evenings, turning every shade of orange and rose and deep violet in a display that made a person understand why people had always sought larger words than beautiful. Timothy had his coffee and Catherine had her tea, and the natural history book was on the table beside her. Though she was not reading it, she was watching Daniel investigate the porch steps with the expression of a woman whose happiness is too full for any single face to contain it. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "When Daniel died, I thought that what I had lost was a specific person, and I had. I had lost my husband and the life we were building together and all the future years of it." She paused. "But I also lost, for a long time, the belief that I was the kind of person who belonged in that kind of life, who deserved to be happy in an ordinary, daily, unglamorous way. I convinced myself that the right response to what had happened was to seal that part of myself away and just work." He was quiet, listening. "And then you came," she said, "and you didn't come with any drama or declaration. You just came with your references and your sensible conversation and your patience, and you made yourself useful, and you paid attention to a mare that everyone else had given up on, and you remembered things I said 2 months after I said them." She turned to look at him. "You showed me, very slowly and very steadily, that the ground was still solid, that it was safe to come out." He held her gaze. His expression was the open one, the one that matched hers without any reserve. "You showed me the same thing," he said. "In different terms. I had spent a long time moving from place to place and being good at work but not particularly at home anywhere. I had given up on the idea that home was something I was going to find." He glanced at the ranch, the barn and the corral and the mesquite, and the live oak holding their ground in the evening light. "This is home. You are home. That's not a small thing for a man who'd been looking for it for 15 years without knowing exactly what he was looking for." On the porch steps, Daniel had successfully navigated down and was now on the ground, and had found something in the dirt of the yard that he considered profoundly interesting. Hector sat beside him with the patient attention of a guardian who understands the importance of his office. "I am going to have another child," Catherine said. He turned to look at her. "In February again, roughly," she said, with the direct simplicity that was entirely her. "The doctor confirmed it last week." He sat for a moment with this new fact arranging itself in his chest into the shape of another very large joy, and then he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "Extremely well." He took her hand and held it in the way he always held it, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and they sat in the extraordinary July evening, and watched their son conduct his investigations and were, both of them, completely and without reservation happy. The winter of 1887 was cold and demanded everything from a ranch operation. The pipes needed watching, and the cattle needed extra hay, and the creek crossing that Timothy had rebuilt proved its worth 3 times over when the January rains came. Catherine managed the ranch accounts from the kitchen table with a nursing infant in the crook of her arm, because a ranch does not pause for new life, and she would not have wanted it to. The new child was a boy as well, born in the first week of February in the same room and with the same midwife and the same Martha Doyle, and he arrived with more efficiency than his brother but no less noise. Timothy held him in the kitchen doorway and Martha said, "Another one," with the tone of a woman who has been enormously right about everything and is maintaining dignity about it. They named him Henry Walt Reed, the second name for Walt Briggs, who received this information sitting in the kitchen with his coffee and was quiet for a moment, and then said, with a gruffness that fooled no one, "That's a sound name," and looked at his coffee cup for a long moment before anything else was said. Walt stayed on the ranch. He never did retire. His joints troubled him in the cold, and he moved with more deliberateness each year, but he never stopped being useful, and the Reeds never stopped needing him, and never would have dreamed of pressing the retirement timeline. He became, over the years, something between an elder employee and a family institution, the way certain people fit so completely into the life around them that removing them would leave a shape rather than just a gap. Cody did eventually marry Alice Drummond, the schoolteacher, in the spring of 1887, and Alice brought to the arrangement a formidable organizational intelligence that improved Cody's life in every measurable respect. Alice and Catherine became genuine friends, which Catherine had not expected and which pleased her deeply, because Alice was one of those women who engage ideas with real energy and who will argue a point to its conclusion without apology, which Catherine found entirely refreshing. Martha Doyle remained the anchor of Catherine's friendship world, as she had been since they were 7 years old, and she came to the ranch every few weeks and sat in the kitchen with her tea, and declared her satisfaction with the way things had turned out in tones that implied she had arranged all of it, which no one seriously disputed. By the autumn of 1887, the Keller Reed Ranch was as sound and as settled and as genuinely prosperous as a moderate-sized Texas cattle operation could be. The land was well managed and the cattle were healthy, and the fences Timothy had built and rebuilt were straight and true. The limestone house had been expanded by a single room when Henry was born, built properly with stone from the creek bed, and it sat on its land with the permanence of something that had always been there and always intended to remain. On a September evening that was the twin of the one 2 years before, warm and golden and full of the sounds of the Texas evening, Catherine stood at the kitchen window washing the supper dishes and watched Timothy in the yard with Daniel, who was 3 years old, and conducting himself with the energy and absolute conviction of a 3-year-old boy on a mission. Timothy was crouched down in the dirt beside him, listening to whatever Daniel was explaining with the focused attention he brought to everything, treating the child's 3-year-old logic with the same respect he brought to a ranch problem or a conversation with Catherine or a difficult horse. Henry was asleep in the sitting room. Hector was on the porch. The live oak trees were holding their ground in the September evening as they always had and always would, ancient and patient and indifferent to everything except the business of being alive. Catherine looked at the scene in her yard, her husband and her son in the last light of the September day, and felt something that she had not been able to feel for a very long time, not in the years of solitude, not even in the cautious, careful early months of knowing Timothy, but now she felt it clearly and completely. She felt that the house was finished, that the floor was solid, that she was standing in a life that was whole. She had not accepted a dinner invitation for 5 years, and then Timothy Reed had come, and he had not invited her to anything. He had simply shown up with the food, metaphorically and then literally, with his references and his patience and his memory of things that mattered and his book from the bookseller's wagon and his presence at the dance in September and his ring from Weber's case in December. And with every one of those things made without announcement or demand, he had been saying the same thing: I am here. The ground is solid. Come out when you are ready. She had been ready, and she had come out, and the world had received her without ceremony and with great warmth, and the life that had been interrupted 5 years before had not resumed, because that would have been the wrong framing. A new life had begun. One that carried Daniel Keller's memory with dignity and love, and without the weight of guilt. And that also held Timothy Reed and 2 boys named Daniel and Henry and Martha, Doyle's twice-monthly visits and Walt's coffee and Hector's eternal presence at the door, and the natural history book, and the garnet ring and the dance in September, and all the suppers at the kitchen table and all the evenings on the porch, and all the mornings still ahead. She dried her hands on the dish towel and went out the screen door into the September evening, and Timothy looked up from where he was crouching in the dirt with their son, and he saw her face and he smiled, the full, uncomplicated smile of a man who knows exactly where he is and is exactly glad of it. "Mama," Daniel announced, with the urgency of someone who has been waiting for an audience. "Here I am," she said, and went to them. The September sky was doing its enormous colored work above the ranch, above the limestone house and the sound fences and the well-run barn and the cattle in the creek-watered pastures, above the mesquite and the live oak holding their old ground. The night insects were beginning their chorus in the grass. A mockingbird in the tree by the gate was running through its entire repertoire with great conviction. Timothy stood and put his arm around Catherine's shoulders, and she leaned into his side, and Daniel sat in the dirt at their feet and informed Hector of several important facts. Henry was asleep in the house behind them, warm and entirely unaware of how good everything was. They stood together in the last light of that September evening on their solid ground in their finished house, in the full and unhurried life they had built, and there was nothing left to want for, nothing unresolved, nothing waiting to fall. Only this, only all of this, day after day, ordinary and extraordinary, theirs.